On March 18, 1942, in the town of Belchatow, Poland, German occupation authorities carried out a public execution. 10 Jewish were brought to the town square and hanged in full view of the local population. The victims had been arrested earlier that month along with several others. While some were released, these 10 were chosen for execution. Nazi officials used such spectacles as a means of intimidation, forcing residents to watch as the condemned men were placed on the gallows. Archival records identify several of the victims by name, preserved in testimonies and memorial books compiled after the war. This execution was one of many carried out across occupied Poland during 1942, intended to terrorize communities and enforce absolute obedience under German rule. Do the shadows of these wartime atrocities still influence global politics today? Let's discuss it in the comments. Available in 22 languages. On June 1, 1946, justice was carried out in Bucharest. Marshal Ion Antonescu, Romania's wartime dictator, stood before a firing squad. Alongside him were 3 others: Mihai Antonescu, his deputy; Gheorghe Alexinu, the governor of occupied Transnistria; and Constantine Vasiliu, a senior military officer. These men had been tried and convicted by the Romanian People's Tribunal for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Their regime had aligned Romania with Nazi Germany, sending troops to fight on the Eastern Front, deporting and killing Jews and Roma, and enforcing brutal occupation policies in territories under their control. On that day, all 4 were led out into the courtyard of Jalava prison. They were tied to wooden posts, blindfolded, and placed before the rifles of the firing squad. With a single volley of shots, the dictatorship that had ruled Romania during its darkest years came to a violent end. Pietro Koch was one of fascist Italy's most feared secret police leaders during World War II. As head of the notorious Banda Koch, he was responsible for brutal arrests, torture, and executions of resistance members and civilians. After the fall of Mussolini, Koch was captured, tried for war crimes, and sentenced to death. On June 5, 1945, he was executed by firing squad, a dramatic end for a man once feared across Italy. Gunther Billing was a German paratrooper involved in one of World War II's most daring infiltration missions. Disguised in American uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge, he and 2 comrades, including Manfred Pernis, were sent behind enemy lines to sabotage Allied communications and supply routes. The mission failed when they were captured by U.S. forces. Tried as spies under the Geneva Convention, they faced the inevitable death sentence. On December 23, 1944, Gunther Billing and his fellow saboteurs were executed by firing squad. But was this a fair sentence, or simply wartime vengeance? Joseph Wendy, just 18 years old, was executed on November 11, 1944, in Toul, France. A young Polish man drafted into the German army. He crossed behind American lines disguised as a civilian slave laborer. Caught, he was tried by a U.S. military commission on October 18, 1944, and convicted of espionage. On the day of his execution, Wendy was led to the shooting site in a farmhouse garden. Witnesses reported a solemn scene. Military police positioned him. A priest uttered last prayers, and amid tense stillness, the firing squad took aim. The shots rang out, and the 18-year-old spy fell. A stark reminder of how war turns mere youths into symbols of betrayal. Today, a rare film clip of this execution circulates in historical archives, an enduring, haunting record of Wendy's final moments. On December 1, 1945, near Rome, German General Anton Dassler stood before a firing squad. During World War II, Dassler had ordered the execution of 15 captured American soldiers in Italy. These men, taken prisoner in uniform, should have been protected under the Geneva Convention. Instead, they were shot, an order Dassler signed personally. At his trial, the general offered the familiar defense: "I was only following orders." But the U.S. military tribunal rejected it. Blind obedience could not excuse the deliberate murder of prisoners of war. That cold morning, Dassler was tied to a post, his hands bound, his eyes covered. The command was given. Rifles fired in unison. The general fell lifeless. Anton Dassler was the first German general executed by the Allies after World War II. But was this execution truly justified? At Landsberg prison, Wilhelm Wagner, an SS officer from the Dachau concentration camp, was led to the gallows. Wagner had been tried by a U.S. military tribunal and convicted of war crimes. Survivors testified that he took part in brutal selections of prisoners, sending some to forced labor and others to certain death. His name was tied to cruelty and violence inside one of the most infamous camps of the Nazi regime. But Wagner's execution was remembered not only for his crimes. It was remembered for the way he faced his death. As he walked to the gallows, he did not tremble. Witnesses described him as calm, almost casual. This image, a condemned SS officer smiling at the edge of death, has remained one of the most chilling and unusual accounts of World War II executions. But what do you think? Was it courage in the face of death? Or was it simply the disturbing mindset of a man shaped by brutality and war? Michael Redwitz was an SS officer at Dachau, known for his brutality toward prisoners, beatings, torture, and executions. After the war, he was tried and found guilty of war crimes. On May 29, 1946, at Landsberg prison, Michael Redwitz was hanged, justice delivered for the crimes of Dachau. This man, Arno Lippmann, once held power inside the Nazi camp system, but in 1946 he would face the gallows. Born in 1890, Lippmann rose through the SS ranks and by the war's end had become commandant of the Kaufering subcamps of Dachau. Survivors remembered him for his brutality, overseeing forced labor, punishments, and the suffering of thousands of prisoners. After Germany's defeat, Lippmann was arrested and brought before the U.S. military tribunal at Dachau. Witnesses described his role in the deaths of countless inmates, and the court found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On May 29, 1946, in the prison yard at Landsberg, Arno Lippmann was led to the gallows. Moments later, the rope ended the life of a man who had once ruled over camps of misery and death. But can the execution of one man ever measure up to the suffering of thousands? Arthur Greiser, Nazi Germany's Gauleiter of the Warthegau, was one of the most powerful men in occupied Poland. In his cell, he awaited judgment for policies that brought terror to millions. As the highest Nazi official in Western Poland, Greiser oversaw mass deportations, executions, and the persecution of Jews and Poles alike. His region became a testing ground for some of the regime's most brutal racial laws. At his trial in Poland after the war, witnesses described in detail the destruction he ordered and the suffering he inflicted. The evidence was overwhelming. The tribunal sentenced him to death for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Shortly after the verdict, cameras captured Greiser being led to a car that would take him to his final destination. Pale and silent, the man who once ruled over the Warthegau now faced the judgment of history. Dominicus Thomas was a Nazi collaborator who betrayed Jews, resistance members, and political opponents to the Gestapo, sending many to torture and death. After the war, he was captured and tried by an Allied tribunal. Witnesses testified how his denunciations destroyed countless lives, but Thomas claimed he was only following orders. The court found him guilty of war crimes, and on January 12, 1946, at Bruxelles prison, he was hanged. But can betrayal ever be justified by obedience? Dr. Fritz Hintermeyer, SS officer and chief physician of the Dachau concentration camp, was executed by hanging at Landsberg prison on May 29, 1946. During the war, Hintermeyer betrayed his medical oath. Evidence showed that he administered lethal injections to 2 pregnant women, assisted in the murder of 7 mentally ill prisoners, and participated in executions to ensure their death. His role made him not a healer, but a willing instrument of Nazi terror. In late 1945, he was tried in the main Dachau war crimes trial and convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. His death sentence was upheld in April 1946. The doctor, once possessed of the power of life and death, now, silent and pale, possessed the power of life and death himself. Moments later, the ropes tightened and Fritz Hintermeyer's life ended. This old man was executed because he'd been one of Dachau's most brutal overseers. Franz Botker, born in 1888, served as a work and roll call supervisor at the camp. He directed prisoner labor details, oversaw transports, and was remembered by survivors for his relentless cruelty. He took part in mass executions, including the killing of Soviet prisoners, and even shot a collapsing man during a death march in 1945. His reputation for violence spread terror among those under his command. After the war, he was captured and put on trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On May 29, 1946, Franz Botker was led to the gallows at Landsberg prison. Moments later, the rope ended the life of one of Dachau's feared executioners. This man, Fritz Becker, was not an SS officer. He was a capo, a prisoner given power over others inside the camps. Survivors remembered him for his cruelty, beating fellow inmates, enforcing brutal labor, and showing loyalty to the SS. For many prisoners, capos like Becker were as feared as the guards themselves. After the war, Becker was captured, put on trial for war crimes, and sentenced to death. His execution ended the reign of a man who had once traded survival for brutality. On June 29, 1945, in the prison yard at Rheinbach, German civilian Matthias Gierens was led to the gallows. Just weeks earlier, in the town of Ahrweiler, the Allies held their very first war crimes trial against civilians in occupied Germany. Gierens stood accused of participating in the brutal killing of 2nd Lieutenant Lester E. Roos, a 21-year-old U.S. airman who had parachuted to safety after his bomber was shot down in August 1944. Eyewitnesses testified that local men surrounded Roos. One shot him, another beat him with a stick, and Gierens himself struck the lieutenant with a hammer. The violence left Roos dead in the field where he landed. At trial, Gierens and accomplice Peter Cohn were sentenced to death. Weeks later, before a silent audience, their sentences were carried out by hanging. It was a historic moment, the first Allied execution of civilians for war crimes. Johann Baptist Eichelsdorfer was the last commander of the Kaufering forced subcamp of Dachau. Survivors described his brutality, forced labor, starvation, and executions under his command. After the camp's liberation, a chilling photo showed him standing among the bodies of murdered prisoners. He was tried in the Dachau main trial, found guilty of war crimes, and sentenced to death. On May 29, 1946, Johann Baptist Eichelsdorfer was hanged at Landsberg prison. Joseph Hartgen, a German civilian, was executed in 1945 for his role in one of the most shocking crimes of the war, the Rüsselsheim massacre. On August 26, 1944, after an American bombing raid on Rüsselsheim, a group of captured U.S. airmen were marched through the streets. Enraged civilians, led by Hartgen, attacked them with stones, clubs, and hammers. 6 of the airmen were beaten to death in front of the crowd. When the war ended, Hartgen and several others were arrested and tried by a U.S. military tribunal. Witnesses identified him as one of the ringleaders, urging the mob to kill the prisoners. The court found him guilty of war crimes. On November 10, 1945, Joseph Hartgen was hanged at Bruxelles prison. His execution marked one of the earliest post-war punishments for civilian atrocities against Allied airmen. Karl Bloch, a German civilian, was executed by hanging on January 12, 1946, in the courtyard of Bruxelles prison. Block had been accused of taking part in the brutal killing of captured American airmen during the final months of the war. When U.S. pilots parachuted into Germany, they were supposed to be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, civilians like Block joined in savage beatings that left the airmen dead in the streets. After the war, Block was arrested and brought before a U.S. military tribunal. Witnesses testified to his role in the killings, identifying him as one of the attackers. The court found him guilty of war crimes and sentenced him to death. On that cold January morning in 1946, cameras recorded the moment as Block was led to the gallows in Bruxelles. Moments later, the trap was released, and the man who had joined in the mob killings paid with his life at the rope. On November 11, 1944, in Toul, France, German civilian Stefan Cortes stood accused of espionage. Disguised as a forced laborer, he had crossed Allied lines, gathering intelligence for the German army. His capture led to a swift U.S. military tribunal, which found him guilty of spying behind enemy lines, a crime punishable by death. Testimony revealed that Cortes had provided details on troop movements and supply routes, endangering American lives. His defense, that he was coerced and merely following orders, failed to convince the judges. The verdict was clear: death by firing squad. At dawn, soldiers led him to a clearing. A priest whispered final prayers as Cortes was tied to a post. The order was given. A volley of rifles shattered the silence, and within seconds, Stefan Cortes collapsed lifeless. Manfred Pernis was a German paratrooper sent behind enemy lines during World War II. Disguised in American uniforms, he and two comrades carried out sabotage missions during the Battle of the Bulge, aiming to confuse Allied troops and disrupt their supply lines. All three were captured by U.S. forces and tried as spies, a charge that meant certain death. On December 23, 1944, Pernis and his fellow soldiers faced a firing squad. Witnesses recalled that he remained calm to the end, accepting his fate without fear. But what do you think? Was this execution justice or vengeance? Martin Gottfried Weiss, known as the Demon of Dachau, was executed by hanging on May 29, 1946, at Landsberg Prison. Weiss served as commandant in several Nazi concentration camps: Neuengamme from 1940 to 42, Majdanek in 1943 to 44, and finally Dachau in 1945, where he assumed control just before Germany's defeat. Witnesses and camp records exposed his involvement in mass executions, forced labor, and the atrocious conditions in the camps. After his arrest in Munich in April 1945, Weiss was tried in the Dachau main trial beginning November 1945. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, for his role in the terror of the camps, and for supervising special euthanasia-style killings. Shortly before his execution, he cried out, "I am dying for Germany." This old man, Johannes Oper, was executed in 1945 for his role in the Rüsselsheim massacre. In August 1944, after an American bombing raid, captured U.S. airmen were marched through the town. Oper and other civilians joined a mob that beat the defenseless pilots to death with stones and clubs. Tried by a U.S. military tribunal, Oper was found guilty of war crimes. On November 10, 1945, he was hanged at Bruxelles Prison, one of 6 civilians executed for the brutal killings. In April 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, German spy Richard Jarczyk was captured by U.S. forces in Kitzingen, Germany. Disguised in civilian clothes, he had crossed Allied lines, gathering intelligence and carrying out sabotage behind the front. His arrest led to a swift military tribunal. Witnesses testified that Jarczyk's actions endangered American soldiers and violated the laws of war. The court found him guilty of espionage, a crime punishable by death. At dawn, Jarczyk was led to an open athletic field. Bound to a wooden post, his eyes blindfolded, he stood silently as a priest offered a final prayer. Moments later, an American firing squad took aim. The order was given. A sharp volley of rifles echoed across the field, and Richard Jarczyk collapsed lifeless at the post. His execution was among the last carried out in wartime Germany. Wilhelm Dietermann, a German civilian tried for war crimes, was executed by hanging on January 10, 1946, at Bruxelles Prison. Dietermann had taken part in the brutal killing of captured American airmen during the final months of the war. Witnesses described how downed pilots, defenseless and in custody, were beaten and murdered by enraged civilians. Among them, Dietermann was identified as one of the leading attackers. After Germany's surrender, he was brought before a U.S. military tribunal. The evidence was overwhelming, and the court found him guilty of violating the laws of war. His plea that he was carried away by the crowd failed to convince the judges. On that cold January morning in 1946, before U.S. guards and officials, Dietermann was led to the gallows at Bruxelles. Moments later, the trap was released, and justice was delivered for the murdered airmen. This man, Wilhelm Tempel, was an SS guard who served in Dachau's coffering subcamps. Survivors remembered his brutality, beatings, forced labor, and executions carried out under his watch. At the Dachau trials, witnesses described how Tempel personally struck prisoners and even took part in lethal shootings. He admitted in court, "I became anti-Semitic. It is a good thing I'm being executed. I would have killed thousands of Jews." On May 29, 1946, at Landsberg Prison, Wilhelm Tempel was hanged for war crimes and crimes against humanity. On May 28, 1946, at Landsberg Prison in Germany, Anton Endres faced his final moments. Endres had served as an SS medical officer at Dachau, one of the most notorious Nazi concentration camps. There, he was accused of brutal mistreatment and direct participation in the killings of prisoners. Survivors described not only the starvation and forced labor, but also the cruelty of the very men who were supposed to represent medicine and healing. After Germany's defeat, the Allied powers sought justice. Endres was tried by a U.S. military tribunal during what became known as the Dachau trials. These proceedings exposed the horrors of the camps, giving voice to witnesses who had endured unimaginable suffering. Testimonies spoke of guards who beat and executed inmates, of experiments conducted without mercy, and of a system that reduced human beings to numbers. Anton Endres was convicted of war crimes, and his sentence was death by hanging. On the morning of his execution, he was led to the gallows, accompanied by a priest. Witnesses recalled his calm demeanor, but also the swiftness with which justice was carried out. On December 23, 1944, 3 German soldiers, Sergeant Manfred Pernis, Lieutenant Gunther Billing, and Private Wilhelm Schmidt, were executed by a U.S. military firing squad in Belgium. They had been captured during the Battle of the Ardennes as part of Operation Greif, a German operation led by Otto Skorzeny. In this operation, German soldiers donned American uniforms, infiltrated Allied lines, and attempted sabotage, including altering road signs and sowing confusion among U.S. troops. Under the laws of war, fighting in enemy uniform was considered espionage and punishable by death. Following a U.S. military court, Pernis, Billing, and Schmidt were convicted and taken to the village of Henri-Chapelle. That winter morning, they were tied to posts, blindfolded, and forced to face American soldiers' rifles. The sentence was carried out with a single shot. What are your thoughts on these executions? Pietro Caruso, the former fascist police chief of Rome, faced his end on September 22, 1944, at Fort Bravetta. As he was taken from a vehicle, he hobbled forward on crutches. His limp was the result of a broken femur from a car crash during the chaotic final months of the war. Supported as he moved, he was brought to the execution chair. Caruso had been a loyal fascist and a close collaborator with the German occupiers. In March 1944, after a partisan attack killed 33 German soldiers in Rome, he helped compile the list for the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, where 335 civilians and political prisoners were executed in brutal reprisal. After the liberation of Rome, Caruso was quickly put on trial. On September 21st, 1944, Italy's High Court of Justice sentenced him to death for his role in aiding and abetting these atrocities. The very next morning, he was carried to Fort Brevetta. Dr. Claus Carl Schilling was executed by hanging on May 28, 1946, at Landsberg Prison. Before the war, Schilling was a respected tropical medicine specialist at the Robert Koch Institute. But during World War II, he conducted malaria experiments at Dachau concentration camp, infecting over 1,000 prisoners. Many died, and survivors were left with grave injuries. After the war, Schilling was among the defendants at the Dachau trials. Witnesses described how he allowed mosquitoes to bite victims through cages strapped to their limbs, then injected them with experimental drugs. Hundreds perished. Despite his previous reputation, the tribunal found him guilty of war crimes. On the day he was executed, Schilling refused to appeal and even wept, pleading to finish his research. But justice was swift. He was led to the gallows, pronounced dead by hanging, closing a chapter on one of medicine's darkest betrayals. In June 1945, the United States military carried out a rare execution of a Nazi war criminal. The man was Kurt Bruns, a Wehrmacht captain convicted of ordering the murder of 2 American prisoners of war who revealed their Jewish heritage. During the Battle of the Bulge, Bruns learned that the captured men, part of the elite Ritchie Boys intelligence unit, spoke fluent German and were German-born Jews. He reportedly declared, "Jews have no right to live in Germany," and ordered them executed. A U.S. military tribunal swiftly tried Bruns for war crimes. He became the first German war criminal to be executed by firing squad, shot on June 15, 1945, in a quarry at Dinsdorf, Allied-occupied Germany. Bruns was even allowed to wear his uniform, stripped of insignia, as the sentence was carried out. This execution wasn't by hanging, an uncommon but symbolic military judgment at the time, especially for someone tried before the war officially ended. April 1944. Near Naples, Italy, Italo Palese, shirtless, defiant, cigarette aloft, stood tied to a stake, awaiting execution. He and 3 other young fascist saboteurs from the Italian Social Republic had parachuted into Allied-controlled territory. Accused of espionage and sabotage, they were sentenced to death by a U.S. military court. On that spring day, at a quarry near San Angelo in Fermiz, their final moments were framed by the grotesque iconography of resistance. Youthful courage and fanaticism transformed into a tableau of retribution. With the crack of rifles, they fell, symbols of a crushed regime. Their last stand became one of the most haunting images of Italy's brutal, fractured war years. Italo Palese's final request was simple: a last cigarette, and to face his execution without a blindfold. What would you ask for if you knew it was your final moment? On May 22, 1946, in Prague, Nazi official Karl Hermann Frank faced the ultimate punishment. Frank had been one of the most powerful men in occupied Czechoslovakia. As state secretary, he oversaw the brutal repression of resistance and was directly responsible for the massacre at Lidice, the village annihilated after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. Hundreds of men were shot, women deported, and children sent to concentration camps. After the war, Frank was captured by American forces and handed over to Czechoslovakia. His trial in Prague revealed the full extent of his crimes. Witness after witness described his iron-fisted rule and the terror he unleashed upon the Czech people. The verdict was inevitable: death. On that May morning, thousands gathered to watch. Frank was led to the gallows, pale and silent. There, he was executed by the pole-hanging method, a brutal technique where the condemned is hoisted upward by the neck until death. Johann Victor Kirsch, an SS Untersturmführer known for his brutality, was executed by hanging at Landsberg Prison on May 28, 1946. Found guilty of war crimes by a U.S. military tribunal on November 15, 1945, Kirsch had become emblematic of the extreme violence of the SS. Witnesses reported that Kirsch showed no remorse during the trial and even displayed defiance in the face of death. His execution, captured in rare archival footage, encapsulates the post-war reckoning with Nazi officials responsible for atrocities. When the trapdoor opened, a career built on cruelty came to a definitive end. Justice delivered, and history's verdict rendered. Do you believe Johann Victor Kirsch's hanging was true justice for his war crimes, or was it another example of post-war vengeance carried out in the name of justice? On March 29, 1946, in Budapest, two of Hungary's most notorious collaborators faced justice: Laszlo Beki and Laszlo Indra. Both men were high-ranking officials of the Arrow Cross regime, directly responsible for the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. Their names became synonymous with cruelty, betrayal, and blind obedience to Nazi Germany. That morning, they were led to the gallows inside Marco Street prison. Indra walked stiffly, his face pale, yet still trying to appear composed. Beki followed, quieter, glancing once at the gathered guards. Within moments, the nooses tightened. 2 lives ended, and with them, the fascist terror they had helped unleash. Their execution stood as a grim reminder. The architects of mass murder would not escape justice. Johannes Oper was executed by hanging at Bruxelles prison in November 1945. He had been convicted by a U.S. military tribunal for his role in the Russelsheim massacre. On August 26, 1944, after an American bombing raid destroyed much of Russelsheim, 8 captured U.S. airmen were marched through the city. Fueled by anger and propaganda, a mob of civilians, including Johannes Oper, attacked the prisoners with stones, clubs, and hammers. 6 of the airmen were beaten to death in the streets. When the war ended, Allied authorities launched trials against those responsible. Johannes Oper was found guilty of war crimes for his direct participation in the killings. His execution at Bruxelles stood as a stark reminder that mob violence against prisoners of war would be punished without mercy. Would you have joined the angry crowd that day, or would you have stood aside? And what do you think? Was Johannes Oper's execution true justice or simple revenge? Philip Gutlich was executed in November 1945 at Bruxelles prison. He had been convicted by a U.S. military tribunal for his role in the Russelsheim massacre, when 6 American airmen were beaten to death by a mob of civilians after an air raid in August 1944. As the sentence was carried out, Gutlich showed a display of faith. Before approaching the gallows, he kissed a small Bible and a crucifix offered to him by a priest. It was a solemn gesture, perhaps of repentance, perhaps of desperation, in his final minutes. Moments later, he was led to the gallows. The noose was fixed, the trapdoor released, and Philip Gutlich's life came to an end. Do you believe Philip Gutlich's execution was true justice or simply an act of wartime vengeance carried out after World War II? Let's talk about it in the comments. Franz Xaver Strasser was executed on December 10, 1945, at Landsberg prison. He had been a Nazi Party's local leader in Kaplitz, in the Sudetenland. On December 9, 1944, after 2 American airmen were captured near the town, Strasser ordered their execution. After the war, he stood before a U.S. military tribunal in the very first Dachau trials. Witnesses testified that Strasser showed no hesitation when he commanded the men to be shot. The court found him guilty of war crimes and sentenced him to death. On the morning of his execution, he was led to the gallows inside Landsberg. A priest offered him final rites, but moments later the trapdoor opened, ending the life of a Nazi official whose last order had cost 2 American prisoners their lives. But what do you think? Was Strasser's death the true face of justice? Or was it simply part of the wave of vengeance that followed World War II? Let's talk about it in the comments. On December 7, 1945, in the Dachau courtroom, political prisoner and neighborhood leader Christoph Ludwig Noll gave his final testimony before a U.S. military tribunal. Known as the Capo, Noel was accused of beating and torturing other prisoners, and the court ruled that his actions went far beyond maintaining order. Numerous instances of brutality were documented. 2 days later, on December 13, 1945, Noel was sentenced to death by hanging as one of 36 men convicted in the major trial at the Dachau camp. His sentence was carried out in Landsberg prison on May 29, 1946. Noel stands before the firing squad just before his execution. His voice trembles as he speaks. "I didn't beat the prisoners in my block. I just slapped them. I wouldn't have denounced them otherwise." This is a chilling attempt at mitigation. But in light of the horrors witnessed against him, is this remorse or cold denial? Otto Moll, an SS officer remembered as the Butcher of Birkenau, was executed by hanging on May 28, 1946, at Landsberg prison. From 1943 to 1945, Moll oversaw the crematoria and killing operations at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He played a leading role in the mass murder of Hungarian Jews in 1944 and became infamous for his brutality. Survivors recalled how he forced prisoners to burn bodies in open pits and even shot victims himself, showing no trace of mercy. After the war, Moll tried to escape, but he was captured and brought before the U.S. military tribunal at Dachau. Witnesses described his actions in chilling detail, exposing the scale of his crimes. The court found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On that May morning in 1946, Otto Moll was led to the gallows. The man who had overseen mass death at Birkenau met his own end. On March 12, 1946, 4 of Hungary's most notorious wartime leaders were executed by pole hanging, a method chosen for its public and symbolic impact. This marked the final act in Hungary's attempt to reckon with its collaboration with Nazi Germany and the atrocities committed during World War II. The executions took place in Budapest, drawing a massive crowd. The condemned were Ferenc Szalasi, the leader of the Arrow Cross Party and head of the fascist Hungarian state; János Vajna, Minister of the Interior; Kerli Beregfy-Berger, Minister of Defense; and Joseph Gera, a high-ranking member of the fascist regime. Ferenc Szalasi had led Hungary into complete alignment with Hitler's Germany. After taking power in October 1944, his regime oversaw the deportation and murder of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, alongside violent repression of political dissent. János Vajna, as Interior Minister, played a direct role in implementing the Arrow Cross regime's racial laws and facilitating the roundup and torture of civilians. He ordered mass arrests and sanctioned the killings of those considered enemies of the state. Kerli Beregfy-Berger, as defense minister, was responsible for integrating Hungarian forces with the retreating German army during the final months of the war. He was also involved in the mobilization of forced labor and support of Arrow Cross death squads. Joseph Gera was less politically known than the others, but was still deeply involved in the Arrow Cross's violent actions in Budapest. He was convicted of war crimes related to the brutal persecution of civilians during the regime's final months. After the fall of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Hungary by Soviet forces, all 4 men were captured, tried, and found guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and treason. Their trial was held in Budapest and widely publicized. The court sentenced them to death by pole hanging, a method involving the prisoner being hoisted vertically by a rope tied to a post, resulting in a slower and more public death than traditional hanging. It was intended to make a statement. On the morning of their execution, the 4 men were led to the gallows. Each had a final moment before the rope was fixed. Unlike standard hangings, pole hanging left the condemned suspended by their arms, often conscious for several seconds. Szalasi reportedly remained defiant to the end. Vajna and Beregfy appeared pale and resigned. Gera remained mostly silent. No last words were publicly recorded from a group. A crowd gathered to witness the executions. Photographs were taken, and reports circulated rapidly across Hungary and Europe. For some, the hangings brought closure. For others, they were a reminder of how far Hungary had fallen into extremism.